The Galactic Prosperity Council had been running things in space for 12,000 years, and they knew exactly how to handle new species when they found them, because they had done it 847 times before, and every single time it went the same way. So when their sensors picked up faster than light travel from a system they had never checked before, Ambassador Vexthar got ready for another routine first contact, and he brought 17 ships with him because that was the standard procedure, and it always worked. And he had no reason to think this time would be any different. Captain Daniel Brooks stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge and watched the alien ships appear on his screens, and he knew that everyone back on Earth was watching this moment and waiting to see what would happen, because this was humanity's first time meeting anyone else in the universe. And the governments had been arguing for weeks about what to say. But in the end, they told Brooks to use his judgment and trust his instincts. So that is exactly what he planned to do. The alien transmission came through on every frequency, and the computers translated it into English, and Brooks listened carefully as Ambassador Vexthar explained how things were going to work, and the message was clear, and the ambassador seemed to think it was generous too, because he said humanity would get technology and protection and guidance, and all they had to do in return was accept the Council's authority and contribute resources and put their military under Council command, and it all sounded very reasonable, except for one small problem. Brooks did not want any of it. He waited until the ambassador finished talking, and then he activated his own transmitter and said, "Thank you for the offer, but we respectfully decline," and then he waited to see what would happen next. The silence that followed was long and awkward, and Brooks could see his crew looking at each other nervously because they knew this was not what the aliens expected. And finally, Ambassador Vexthar spoke again and said, "Perhaps there was some confusion, because this was not a negotiation, and this was just how new species got welcomed into the galaxy, and humanity needed to send representatives to begin the integration process." Brooks smiled even though the alien could not see his face, and he said, "That is where you are wrong, Ambassador, because everything is a negotiation, and we are not interested in being welcomed into your system, and we will make our own path instead." And then he had the ship rotate slowly, so the aliens could see that while the weapons were not active, the shields were at full power, and he did not make any threats because he did not need to. Ambassador Vexthar did not know what to do, because in all his years of service nothing like this had ever happened. And back in the council chamber, emergency meetings were starting, and everyone was confused, because species were supposed to be grateful for the council's protection and guidance. But these humans did not seem grateful at all. And worse than that, they did not seem scared either, even though they only had one ship, and the council had 17. The ambassador tried again, and explained that the galaxy was dangerous, and without the Council's protection, humanity would face hostile forces, and the Council could keep them safe. Brooks listened, and then replied that humanity offered something different, called respect, and when the Council was ready to talk to humans as equals instead of subjects, then they would be happy to discuss cooperation. But until then, they would defend their own territory and pursue their own interests, and make their own choices, and then he ended the transmission. Vexthar stared at the human ship, and even though it looked primitive compared to Council technology, there was something about it that made him uneasy, and for the first time in his very long career, he genuinely did not know what his next move should be. Back on Earth, Commander Lisa Hayes was watching everything from mission control, and when the transmission ended, she turned to her staff and told them the Council was not going to accept that answer, and they needed to prepare the defense grid immediately because humanity had just told the entire galaxy they would not bow, and now they had to prove they meant it. The Council fleet stayed in position around the human ship, and none of them moved because they were waiting for orders. But the orders did not come because nobody at the Council knew what orders to give, because all their protocols were designed for species that said yes, and they had never planned for a species that just said no on the horizon's edge. Brooks watched the alien ships and waited, and his weapons officer asked if they should power up the main guns, and Brooks said no, because that would be seen as aggression, and right now they were not being aggressive. They were just being firm, and there was a difference, and the aliens needed to understand that hours passed and the standoff continued, And back at the council headquarters, the emergency session was getting heated because some members wanted to destroy the human ship as an example, and others wanted to try negotiating differently. And a few were saying maybe they should just leave and report back, but nobody could agree on anything. Finally, High Arbiter Zentoth, who was the oldest and most senior council member, called for order and said they needed to gather information before making any decisions, and they needed to understand why humanity refused and what humanity actually was. And so he ordered the fleet to pull back, but stay in the system, and he sent stealth probes to observe the humans and learn about them. Over the next several weeks, those probes sent back data, and the council's analysts studied everything they could find about humanity, and what they discovered made them very uncomfortable, because humans were definitely less advanced in many ways, but their weapons technology was surprisingly sophisticated, and they had no unified government. Yet somehow they coordinated perfectly, and they had never met aliens before, but they showed no fear at all. What really worried the analysts was human military history, because every council species followed similar patterns when they fought wars. But humans were different, and they had thousands of years of recorded conflicts, and every single one of them had produced new strategies and tactics, and humans seemed to specialize in finding ways to defeat enemies who were bigger and stronger and better equipped than they were. Commander Lisa Hayes reviewed the reports from their tracking systems and smiled, because the alien stealth probes were not actually very stealthy, and humanity's detection network found them easily. But she ordered her people to let the aliens watch, because she wanted them to see the shipyards and the defense platforms and the weapon systems, and she wanted them to understand that humanity was not afraid. The council received all this intelligence and called another meeting, and this time the aggressive voices were much quieter, because reality was setting in, and if they attacked with overwhelming force, the humans would scatter and fight a guerrilla war that could last for generations. And if they tried an embargo, the humans would just advance on their own, and might surpass council technology eventually. And if they ignored them, the humans would expand into space, and nobody knew how they would treat other species. When they did, Ambassador Vexthar presented his analysis and explained that humanity was dangerous, not because of what they were now, but because of what they could become. And they had gone from first contact to strategic deterrence in just a few weeks. And what would they be capable of in years or decades? High Arbiter Zentoth listened to everything and looked at the data, and realized that the council had 3 options, and all of them were terrible. But one thing was absolutely certain, and that was that humanity was not going to change their position. Captain Daniel Brooks received new orders from Earth, and he read them carefully, and then he opened a channel to the council fleet and transmitted coordinates to humanity's asteroid belt shipyards, where dozens of new vessels were under construction. And the message was very clear, which was that humans were building a fleet, and the council could not stop them. Ambassador Vexthar looked at those coordinates and felt something he had not experienced in centuries, which was genuine fear. 3 months had passed since the first meeting between humanity and the Galactic Prosperity Council, and the situation had gotten much worse than anyone expected, because humanity had not just held their position, they had made it stronger in every possible way. High Arbiter Zentoth sat in his chamber and looked at the latest reports, and he could not believe what he was seeing. Because the humans had built armed stations on 17 different moons and asteroids in their outer system, and their shipyards were producing new vessels at rates that the council's best analysts had said were impossible, and he asked how they were doing. This, Ambassador Vexthar explained that humans were working all day and all night in multiple shifts, and they had converted their civilian factories to make military equipment, and this was something called a wartime economy. And humans had done this before, to themselves, during their own planetary conflicts, and they were very good at it. Counselor Thresh was furious and demanded action, because every day that passed made humanity stronger, and every day made the council look weaker, and other species across the galaxy were watching, and if humanity succeeded in defying the council, then others would try the same thing. This was actually true, because reports were coming in from everywhere, and member species were starting to question policies and ask why humanity got different treatment, and some were wondering if they could also refuse council directives, and the whole foundation of galactic order was beginning to crack. Counselor Kane insisted they had to act now and show their strength, and she suggested destroying one of the human outposts as a warning. But High Arbiter Zentoth said no. and instead ordered the fleet to prepare for a blockade because they would cut humanity off and prevent them from expanding beyond their system and contain them until they agreed to negotiate reasonably. Admiral Lisa Hayes was coordinating everything from the new orbital station above Earth when the warnings started coming through and the sensors showed a massive fleet approaching with 400 Council vessels entering the system. And this was the Council making their big move and bringing overwhelming force to surround humanity's home. Colonel Jake Morris pulled up the defensive positions and counted their ships and did the math and reported that humanity had 73 combat-ready vessels and 240 defense platforms, which meant they were outnumbered 5-1. Captain Daniel Brooks had been called back to Earth for strategic planning, and he corrected Jake and said it was actually 6-1 if you counted properly. But numbers were not everything, and the Council was trying to intimidate them. And humanity needed to show that intimidation would not work. General Richard Lane was in command of all Earth's defense forces, and he made the decision to deploy the fleet in full defensive posture. And he said the Council wanted a blockade so humanity would show them what defensive warfare really looked like. The Council fleet arranged itself in a perfect sphere around the entire human system, because this was the textbook formation for containment, and Admiral Thex commanded from the flagship, and he felt confident this would end quickly, because once humanity saw they were completely surrounded, they would have to surrender. Instead, the human fleet did something the Council did not expect at all, because they did not charge forward and they did not run away, and they just took up positions throughout their system and created overlapping fields of fire with all their platforms, and they used asteroids and planets for cover, and suddenly, every single Council ship found itself potentially targeted by multiple human weapons at once. Admiral Thex sent a transmission and identified himself and told humanity they were surrounded and needed to power down their ships and prepare to receive integration teams, and this was their final warning. Captain Brooks sent the reply personally and identified himself as representing all of Earth's unified governments, and explained that the Council had entered human territory without permission, and now they had 48 hours to withdraw, and after that time expired, humanity would consider the Council's presence an act of war. The Council crews actually laughed when they heard this because the audacity was almost funny, and then their sensor officers started reporting what they were detecting, and nobody was laughing anymore. The reports came in fast and the sensors showed massive energy signatures all over the system, and the humans were powering up weapons the Council had not known existed, and there were thousands of stealth mines scattered everywhere, and multiple human ships were moving to attack positions, and they were using civilian vessels as screens, which meant the Council could not fire without potentially hitting unarmed targets. Admiral Thex felt his confidence drain away, because the humans had turned their entire home system into a fortress, and they had 3 months to prepare, and they used every single moment, and the Council fleet was powerful, but it was spread thin to maintain the blockade while the human forces were concentrated and mobile, and fighting on their home ground where they had every advantage. The tactical officer reported that if fighting actually started, the Council would probably win eventually, but casualties could reach 40% of their fleet, or maybe even higher. 40% meant tens of thousands of dead, and that was genocide by Council standards, because wars were supposed to be clean and quick and decided by clear technological superiority, but this would be bloody and desperate and would go on for a long time, and the Council had the strength to win, but the price would be terrible. Back on Earth, Lisa Hayes monitored the standoff and saw that the Council fleet was hesitating, and she said that was good because they came expecting humanity to fold, but now they realized humans were willing to die defending their home, and that changed everything. Jake Morris asked the question everyone was thinking, which was whether humanity really was willing to die here, because this was not a bluff, and if the Council pushed forward, then real people were going to get killed. Lisa answered quietly and said, then they would get killed, because it was better to fight and lose than to surrender freedom without even trying. And that was what the Council did not understand about humans, because humanity had fought wars throughout history that they knew they would probably lose, but they fought anyway because the alternative was submission, and humans were not like other species. The 48 hours counted down in complete silence, and the entire galaxy watched and waited, and history seemed to hold its breath. When the deadline finally arrived, the Council fleet began to pull back, and they did not go far, just to the edge of the system. And Admiral Thex insisted this was not a retreat, but rather a strategic repositioning. But everyone knew the real truth. Humanity had called the Council's bluff, and the Council had blinked first. In the Council chambers, panic was no longer something creeping slowly toward them, because it had fully arrived and was sitting right there in the room with them. High Arbiter Zentoth convened an emergency session with only the inner council present, and the chamber felt empty and vulnerable in a way it never had before. Ambassador Vexthar reported that 3 member species had formally requested revisions to their integration agreements, and 17 others had filed complaints about resource quotas, and the Kelthon Union was openly discussing whether to leave the council completely. Councillor Thresh radiated fury and said this was what came from showing weakness, and they should have destroyed the humans when they had the advantage. Admiral Thex interrupted and said they still had the advantage, and the projections showed victory with 40% casualties. But the problem was that humanity was willing to accept 100% casualties, and you cannot defeat an enemy that refuses to surrender, and Council forces would not pay the price for total annihilation of another species, because that was not what they signed up for. This was the unspoken truth about the Council's power, which was that their authority rested on mutual agreement and overwhelming technological superiority. But humanity had enough technology to make conflict unbearably costly, and they had demonstrated complete willingness to pay that cost, while the Council forces were staffed by species that had not fought a real war in generations, and they joined for peacekeeping duties, not suicide missions. Zentoth accessed the latest intelligence from the human system, and what he saw disturbed him even more, because humanity was not resting after their victory, and construction was actually accelerating, and they were building what appeared to be a long-range exploration fleet, and they intended to expand into the galaxy. Back on Earth, Lisa walked through the new Strategic Command facility and looked at the screens displaying maps of nearby star systems and potential colony sites and projected expansion routes. Colonel Jake Morris briefed her and said they had identified 43 systems within 20 light-years that showed potential for habitation or resources, and all of them were unclaimed by Council standards. Lisa decided immediately, and said then humanity would claim them by human standards, and they should start with scientific expeditions, but have colony ships ready to follow, and they needed to establish facts on the ground before the Council decided to contest human expansion. The message was clear, and humanity was not waiting for permission. Within weeks of the standoff ending, human expeditions launched toward nearby star systems, and the ships were heavily armed, but clearly marked as scientific missions, and humanity made no secret of their intentions, because they were expanding into the galaxy, and the Council could either accept it or start another confrontation. They could not win. The first incident happened at a system the Council called KC-447, which was 70 light-years from Earth, and a human survey team under Commander Peter Walsh arrived to find a Council monitoring station already there, and the Council crew immediately panicked and started sending distress signals and preparing to evacuate. Walsh opened a communication channel and introduced himself as commander of the Earth survey ship Pathfinder, and explained they were there to conduct scientific studies of the system and had no hostile intentions toward the station, and suggested both groups do their jobs and stay out of each other's way. The Council station commander was a nervous being named Vexilon, who did not know what to do because regulations said to report unauthorized species and wait for Council response, but those regulations assumed the species would either flee or be arrested, and humans did neither of those things. Vexilon transmitted uncertainly and said this system fell under Council jurisdiction. Walsh asked calmly by what right and wanted to know if anyone had claimed the system or built anything there besides the monitoring station or established a colony. And when the answer was no, he said then it was free space and humanity was conducting legitimate scientific research, and the Council was welcome to do the same. Vexilon reported to his superiors, and they reported to the Council. And the Council debated for 3 weeks while the human survey team continued working and cataloging planets and mapping resources and establishing sensor networks, and by the time the Council decided to formally protest humans, had already declared the system open for colonization applications. Similar incidents multiplied across the frontier, and humanity expanded in a dozen different directions, and they always chose unclaimed systems and always operated within technical interpretations of galactic law, and the Council found themselves trapped, because to stop human expansion, they would need to claim every nearby system themselves, but that would violate their own principles about measured development. What made things worse was that not all encounters were confrontational, because some Council member species sent quiet diplomatic messages to humanity, and the Verdant Collective, which was a loose alliance of agricultural worlds, opened informal trade discussions, and the Kelthon Union, which was already unhappy with Council oversight, proposed a mutual defense pact, and a dozen smaller species began sending cultural exchanges. In the Council chambers, Ambassador Vexithar presented the latest analysis and explained they faced a choice between attempting to forcibly contain humanity and risking fragmentation of the Council, or formally recognizing human sovereignty and accepting a multipolar galactic order. High Arbiter Zentoth suggested a third option, which was to invite humanity to join the Council as equals rather than subjects, and give them a seat at the table and bring them into the system. Councillor Thresh recoiled at the idea and said it was impossible because humans had been spacefaring for less than a year, and by what right did they receive equal status to species who had been Council members for thousands of years? Zentoth replied by right of necessity, because they had proven the Council could not force them, and they were demonstrating the Council could not contain them, and if the Council did not bring them inside the system willingly, then humanity would create their own system outside it, and other species would join them. The vote was contentious and difficult, but reality could not be denied, and by a narrow margin the Galactic Prosperity Council authorized formal diplomatic negotiations with humanity, not as supplicants seeking membership, but as potential equals. When the offer arrived, Commander Lisa Hayes read it with satisfaction and said the Council was panicking and trying to control humanity by giving them just enough voice to keep them quiet. Colonel Jake Morris asked if they should accept. Lisa smiled and said absolutely they would accept and take that seat at the table and then use it to change everything. The Council thought they knew about how the galaxy worked. Captain Brooks laughed and said the Council thought they were containing humanity by letting them join, but they did not realize they just invited a fox into the henhouse. Humanity had won without firing a single shot, but the real challenge was only beginning. The Council chambers had never seen anything like Ambassador Claire Martin, who walked through the Grand Hall where representatives of 847 species had gathered for thousands of years, and her modest clothing and simple translator device and confident stride marked her as something entirely new and different. High Arbiter Zentoth formally welcomed humanity to the Galactic Prosperity Council, though his voice carried more weight of defeat than celebration, and Claire took her position among the other representatives and noted the mixture of curiosity and resentment and hope in the alien faces around her. Zentoth announced that the Council recognized Ambassador Claire Martin of humanity, and as a full member species, Earth now held voting rights and responsibilities equal to all others. Claire responded smoothly and thanked the High Arbiter and said humanity was honored to join the Assembly and looked forward to contributing their perspectives to galactic governance. The first session nearly ended in chaos because Claire immediately exercised humanity's voting rights to contest a routine resource allocation that would have diverted materials from the Kelthon Union to Council infrastructure projects, and her objection was based on a close reading of Council charter provisions that most species had forgotten even existed. Claire argued that the charter clearly stated resource levies must be proportional to system productivity and population, and the Kelthon Union had experienced population decline, so increasing their quotas violated the Council's own founding principles. Ambassador Vexithar tried to dismiss the objection and said this was how things had always been done, and the formula was traditional. Claire countered that traditional did not mean legal, and if they were going to have laws, then they should follow them, and that meant all of them, not just the convenient ones. The vote went to the full Council, and to everyone's shock, the Kelthon Union was joined by 17 other species who had been quietly unhappy with similar issues, and Claire's motion passed, and The Council's routine business was suddenly not routine at all. Back on Earth, Lisa reviewed the reports with satisfaction and said Claire was already causing trouble, which was good, because the more the Council had to actually justify their decisions, the more humanity learned about how the system really worked. Jake pulled up the diplomatic traffic and reported that 3 more species had approached them about bilateral agreements, and the Verdant Collective had formally requested a trade treaty, and things were moving very fast. Lisa observed that the Council held together because nobody questioned it. But humanity was not revolutionary. They were just asking questions like why this rule, and who benefits from that policy, and what is the actual justification. And it turned out that a lot of Council governance was just habit. Pretending to be Law General Richard Lane joined them with fleet status reports and said human expansion continued unopposed, and they had established footholds in 8 new systems, and Council monitoring stations were present in 6 of them. But everyone was being professional, and there had been no incidents. Lisa noted that was because the Council could not afford incidents, because every confrontation risked showing weakness, so it was better to pretend everything was according to plan. In the Council chambers, Claire was just getting started, and she proposed amendments to trade regulations and questioned military deployment protocols, and most controversially introduced a motion for member species to have the right to withdraw from the Council. With adequate notice, Claire argued that species joined the Council voluntarily, but there was no provision for leaving except dissolution or exile, and that was not governance but rather captivity with good public relations. The debate that followed was fierce, and Zentoth himself spoke against the proposal and said the Council provided stability, and allowing casual withdrawal would create chaos. Claire responded that they should prove their value, because if species stayed only because they were not allowed to leave, then the Council was not really a council, but a prison. And if species stayed because membership genuinely benefited them, then they had nothing to fear from an exit clause. The motion failed, but barely. And more importantly, the debate itself had changed something fundamental, because species began openly discussing whether Council membership truly served their interests, and the unquestioned authority had been questioned, and the answer was not satisfactory to everyone. Captain Daniel Brooks commanded the exploration vessel New Horizons, which was part of humanity's expanding deep space fleet, and his mission took him beyond Council space, entirely into regions that had never been charted, and what he found there changed everything once again. Brooks sent a priority transmission to Ambassador Claire Martin and reported that they had made contact with an unaffiliated species called the Solani, and explained they had been avoiding the Council for centuries. Claire reviewed the data from her quarters at the Council and learned that the Solani were technologically advanced and numerous, and had deliberately chosen isolation over integration because they had encountered the Council before and rejected membership, then retreated into deep space to avoid any conflict. Claire asked why they were coming forward now. Brooks replied it was because humanity was not the Council, and the Solani had been watching human interactions with the Council, and they saw humanity as proof that there was an alternative to Council control, and they wanted to talk and not join anything but just talk and trade and coexist. Claire brought the matter to the Council with her usual directness and announced that humanity had established diplomatic contact with the Solani and intended to pursue formal relations with them, and she was informing the Council as a courtesy, not requesting permission. The chamber erupted in anger and confusion because a non-Council species establishing independent relations violated everything the Council stood for, but it also clearly fell within humanity's rights as a sovereign member. Species. High Arbiter Zentoth tried to find middle ground and said surely this matter required Council oversight, because unknown species could pose security risks. Claire countered that the Solani had been known to the Council for centuries, and the Council had chosen not to pursue relations with them, and humanity was choosing differently, and unless the Council claimed authority over all diplomacy by all member species, which would itself violate charter provisions about sovereignty, then humanity would proceed with their plans. The vote was unnecessary because the charter was clear, even if everyone had conveniently ignored those sections before, and member species could conduct their own diplomacy and the Council could advise, but not forbid. Within 1 year of joining the Council, humanity had fundamentally altered how it functioned, because Claire's relentless citation of charter provisions forced the Council to actually follow its own rules, and her proposals for reform gained growing support from species tired of arbitrary governance and humanity's example of independent action while remaining within the system provided a model others could follow. Ambassador Vexthar met privately with Claire in her quarters, and he looked exhausted and perhaps defeated, and said she had destroyed everything the Council built. Claire corrected him gently, and said no, they had exposed what the Council built, which was a system that worked only because nobody questioned it, and that was not stability, but stagnation enforced by fear. And Habit Vexthar asked what would replace it, and whether it would just be chaos. Claire suggested genuine cooperation where species worked together, because it benefited them, not because they had no choice, and competition that drove innovation and diversity of approaches instead of enforced uniformity. And yes, it was messier, but it was honest. Vexthar left without responding, but he carried that conversation back to High Arbiter Zentoth, and the ancient leader listened quietly to his old friend's concerns. Zentoth finally said, perhaps they had been so focused on maintaining order that they forgot why order mattered, because it should serve the people, not control them. And these humans, as frustrating as they were, may have reminded the Council of something important they had forgotten. Vexthar countered that maybe humans had set them on a path to collapse instead. Zentoth acknowledged that perhaps both things were true, and only time would tell. On Earth, Lisa Hayes reviewed the strategic situation with her command staff and asked for an assessment of where things stood 5 years after first contact. Jake Morris summarized the situation and reported they had established colonies in 12 systems and had formal diplomatic relations with 43 species, and 21 of those were outside Council channels, and the human fleet was now 300 ships strong, and there had been no hostile actions against humanity in 2 years. Lisa asked about the Council. Brooks reported from his ship via hologram and said they were adapting faster than anyone expected because they were reducing mandatory quotas and increasing local autonomy. And Claire's proposals were actually being taken seriously now, and it was still the Council, but it was becoming something better. General Richard Lane smiled slightly and said, so humanity won. Lisa corrected him and said humanity survived and they refused to be absorbed. And the galaxy did not end, and that was a win. But the bigger win was that humanity proved there was room for different approaches, and the Council panicked when humans refused to negotiate on their terms. But now they were learning to negotiate on everyone's terms. Claire's transmission from the Council chambers appeared on their screens, and she recommended making a formal proposal for a galactic federation that would not replace the Council but exist alongside it, with member species joining voluntarily, and structure being democratic and no forced integration. And she thought they could get enough support. Now Lisa looked at her team and thought about how far they had come in just 5 years, from unknowns in a galaxy of established powers to architects of a new order. And all because they had done something simple and terrifying, which was they said no. Lisa decided to tell Claire to proceed and said they should see if they could build something better. The message went out across faster than light channels, and humanity proposed a new model for galactic civilization, and not everyone would join, and not everyone would approve, but the conversation had begun, and nothing would be the same. In the Council chambers, Zentoth read humanity's proposal with something that might have been respect, because the Council had panicked when humanity refused to negotiate, but now they were negotiating with a partner. They could no longer ignore or absorb. He reflected that perhaps this was what progress actually looked like, because it was uncomfortable and uncontrolled and absolutely necessary. The Solani emerged from isolation and met with human diplomats, and then approached other species who were dissatisfied with Council governance. And within months, a loose coalition began forming of species who valued sovereignty and independence. The Kelthon Union officially signed a mutual defense pact with Earth, and 3 other species joined immediately after. And the Council watched nervously as alternatives to their authority took shape. Claire proposed the Federation Charter in a formal council session and laid out the principles clearly, which were voluntary membership and democratic decision-making, and no species could be forced to join or prevented from leaving, and all members would be treated as equals, regardless of how long they had been spacefaring. The debate lasted for weeks, and the Council was divided sharply between those who saw the Federation as a threat and those who saw it as an evolution. Counselor Thresh led the opposition and argued that humanity was destroying the order that had kept peace for millennia and splitting the galaxy into factions. Claire responded that the Council had kept control, not peace, and there was a difference, and species that were genuinely happy with Council membership had nothing to fear from alternatives, and those that were not happy deserved the right to choose differently. High Arbiter Zentoth surprised everyone by speaking in favor of allowing the Federation to form, and he said the Council had been challenged by reality and needed to adapt, and humanity had proven that forced unity was not sustainable, and perhaps it never had been. The vote was close, but the Council agreed not to oppose the formation of the Federation, and it was framed as allowing an experiment in alternative governance. Within months, 30 species had signed the Federation Charter, including several who maintained dual membership in both the Council and the Federation, and humanity's vision of multiple coexisting systems began to take shape. The galaxy was changing faster than anyone had imagined possible. 10 years after first contact, the galaxy looked completely different from how it had been when Ambassador Vexithar first arrived at Earth with his 17 ships, expecting routine integration of another primitive species, the Galactic Prosperity. Council still existed and still held significant power, but it was no longer the unquestioned supreme authority it had been for 12,000 years, because now there was the Federation of Sovereign Worlds, which had grown to include 83 member species and was expanding steadily. Ambassador Claire Martin stood in the Federation Assembly Hall, which humanity had built on a neutral world halfway between Earth and Council space, and looked out at the representatives of dozens of species who had chosen independence over the security of Council control. The Solani delegate approached her with what passed for a smile among his species, and said he wanted to thank humanity for showing the galaxy that alternatives were possible. Claire replied that humanity had just asked questions and refused to accept things the way they were, and it turned out a lot of other species had been wanting to ask the same questions but were afraid to be the first. The Council had adapted in response to the Federation's existence, and High Arbiter Zentoth had pushed through reforms that gave member species more autonomy and reduced mandatory contributions, and allowed for the first time in history the possibility of species choosing modified membership terms rather than full integration. Ambassador Vexithar, who now served as the Council's liaison to the Federation, met regularly with Claire, and their relationship had evolved from adversarial to something approaching friendship built on mutual respect. Vexithar admitted during one of their private meetings that he had been terrified when humanity first refused the Council's terms, because he genuinely believed the galaxy would descend into chaos without central authority. Claire asked if he still believed that. Vexithar considered the question carefully and said no. He did not, because what actually happened was more complex than either chaos or control, and species were finding their own paths and forming their own alliances. And yes, there were more conflicts than before, but they were smaller and resolved faster, because nobody had the power to impose solutions and everyone had to negotiate. Back on Earth, Commander Lisa Hayes had been promoted to Admiral, and now oversaw humanity's entire space fleet, which had grown to over 1,000 vessels. And she walked through the memorial garden that had been built to honor the 19 humans who had died during the past decade in various incidents and skirmishes. Colonel Jake Morris joined her and commented that the price had been remarkably light, considering they had essentially restructured galactic civilization. Lisa agreed but said every life lost still mattered, and humanity had been lucky in many ways, because they could have faced total war instead of political confrontation. Jake asked if she thought it was over. Lisa laughed and said it would never be over, because civilization was not something you achieved and then maintained, but rather something you constantly negotiated and rebuilt. And humanity had just proven that negotiation was possible, even when it seemed impossible. Captain Daniel Brooks commanded a joint exploration fleet that included ships from humanity and the Solani and 4 other Federation species, and they were charting regions of space that neither the Council nor the Federation had explored. He sent regular reports to both organizations because information sharing had become standard practice, and competition in exploration was friendly rather than hostile, and Brooks thought this was probably the best possible outcome of first contact. The Council and Federation had established trade agreements and mutual defense protocols, and while they remained separate organizations, They cooperated on issues of common interest like piracy and natural disasters and scientific research. There were tensions, of course, because some Council species resented the Federation's existence and saw it as a challenge to tradition, and some Federation species pushed for complete separation from all Council influence. But the overall trajectory was toward coexistence rather than conflict. High Arbiter Zentoth announced his retirement after serving for 3,000 years, and in his final address to the Council, he spoke about how humanity had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their system. He said the Council had believed their way was the only way, and that universal adoption of their model was necessary for peace, but humanity had shown that diversity of governance was not only possible, but potentially beneficial, because it created options and allowed species to choose what worked best for them. His replacement was a younger leader named Keth Ara, who had been one of the early supporters of Council reform, and she immediately opened formal diplomatic relations with the Federation as equals rather than as a rival organization. To be contained, Ambassador Claire Martin attended the ceremony marking this new relationship, and in her speech she acknowledged that humanity's path had not been easy and that refusing to bow to authority came with real costs and risks. She said humanity had been willing to fight and die for their sovereignty, but they were even more glad they had found a way to change the system without massive bloodshed. And she hoped the Council and Federation would continue finding ways to coexist and cooperate. The Kelthon Union, which had been one of the first species to align with humanity, had become a major power in the Federation, and their leader spoke about how they had been silently dissatisfied with Council governance for centuries, but had not known how to express it without being labeled as troublemakers. He said humanity gave them permission to question and to choose differently, and that was a gift more valuable than any technology or resources. Lisa Hayes watched the ceremony from Earth via live transmission and turned to her staff and said this was what success looked like, because 10 years ago the Council had panicked when humanity refused to negotiate, and today they were negotiating as partners. Jake Morris pointed out that there were still challenges ahead, because not all species were happy with the changes, and some wanted to return to the old system while others wanted more radical reforms. Lisa acknowledged this was true, but said humanity had never expected to solve all problems forever, but only to prove that change was possible, and the rest was up to everyone to work out together. General Richard Lane had retired from active duty, but remained an advisor to Earth's government, and he reflected in an interview that humanity's greatest strength during first contact had been their willingness to accept consequences. He explained that the Council expected humanity to back down when faced with overwhelming force, because most rational species would choose survival over principle, but humanity had made clear they would rather die free than live as subjects, and that was not because humans were suicidal, but because they understood that some things were worth fighting for. The interviewer asked if he would have actually ordered the fleet to fight knowing they would. Likely Luzlane was quiet for a moment and then said yes, he would have, because the alternative was teaching humanity's children that freedom was not worth defending, and that was a lesson he refused to pass on. Captain Brooks returned from his latest exploration mission and brought with him representatives from 2 newly contacted species who had never encountered either the Council or the Federation. Claire met with them and explained the situation honestly, including the conflicts and tensions, and the ongoing negotiations, and gave them information about both organizations without pressure to join. Either one of the new species asked why they should trust anything humanity said, given that humans had challenged the established order. Claire replied they should not trust anyone blindly, but should investigate for themselves and make their own choices, and that was exactly the point humanity had been trying to make all along. The new species eventually chose to maintain independence while establishing trade relations with both the Council and the Federation, and this became the emerging model for many newly contacted civilizations. Ambassador Vexthar met with Claire one final time before his own retirement and told her that he had spent the first year after humanity's refusal convinced that Brooks and the rest of the humans were dangerous radicals who would destroy civilization. Claire asked what he thought. Now Vexthar smiled and said he thought humanity had saved civilization by forcing it to evolve, because the Council's static model would have eventually collapsed under its own rigidity. But now there was flexibility and choice, and room for different approaches. He thanked her for teaching an old ambassador that change was not the same as chaos. Claire responded that he had taught her that even powerful systems could learn and adapt, and that was equally valuable. The galaxy continued turning and civilizations continued growing and changing, and the question of governance remained forever open to discussion and negotiation. Humanity had not created a perfect system because no such thing existed, but they had proven that better systems were possible if people were willing to question and willing to fight and willing to negotiate. And perhaps most importantly, they had shown that refusing to accept things as they were was not rebellion, but responsibility. The Council no longer panicked when species questioned their authority because they had learned to see questions as opportunities rather than threats. The Federation continued expanding and evolving, and sometimes struggling but always moving forward.